Hi, thanks for joining us on Book Club tonight. We're doing chapter 3 of Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown, and the chapter is called High Lonesome Spiritual Crisis. I'm sorry I'm pre-recording this because my internet up here in the hills is not very good. So I'm sitting here in my library and enjoying the late summer afternoon sunlight, and I'll just give you a quick little look around the library just so you can see my family photos and my books and the view out the window, the couch, around to the window seat and more books, and the mess on my desk with more books. So yeah, that's where I am, just so you can place me. This chapter was a really interesting one for me because as a writer, Brené Brown writes about this type of music, this high lonesome, and she talks about the fact that the music expresses a sorrow that perhaps other people can't do. It expresses pain, it expresses loss and wrenching emotions, she says. The magic of high lonesome sound is the magic of all art, the ability to both capture our pain and deliver it from us at the same time. So to capture and deliver us from pain. So for me as a writer, I'm often writing about life problems and things that are challenges, and trying to give people a way through to relate to it, to share in it, and then perhaps to process. Now, I'm a reader, a big reader, and so often I process things through reading. So this is one of the first things that struck me about this chapter, in that I could relate to the idea that art can express things that perhaps I can't articulate for myself. Other people might relate more to music. I happen to relate to books. Some people may relate to more visual arts, paintings or photographs, or even just being out in nature. God's art, I guess. But I guess when we hear someone else express our grief or our sorrow, and we relate to it, that's a real connection. And Brené writes about the fact that at the moment the world is really a fractured place, and I've written quite a bit about this in recent weeks in my Kin Women post, and I've been thinking about it for myself as well, that the world just shouts at each other. We seem to have this polarized place on the opinion spectrums, and you're either for something or against, and there's not much space for people to be in the middle and to not necessarily not have an opinion, but to work things out, to share, and not to shout at each other, but to actually sit down and have a conversation. And I think that Brené says we're screaming at one another from further and further away. Rather than dancing and praying together, we're running from one another. Rather than pitching wild and innovative new ideas that could potentially change everything, we're staying quiet and small in our bunkers and loud in our echo chambers. She says we're in a collective spiritual crisis. And I guess if you think that we're all connected in some way, shape or form, and in my blog about this chapter today, I wrote about visiting Skid Row in LA and being confronted with people from a whole different background to me, different living situation. Here I am in a beautiful home in Australia, and in a beautiful space in my home, very privileged, and yet I held hands and danced with a woman in the middle of the street in LA, in Skid Row, who had been homeless but had been in a program for a year, had been off drugs, she said, for a year. She was the same age as me, and I looked at her with connection and a real sense of, if I had been born in a different situation, if I had a different partner, if I had a different trail of my life, I could have maybe ended up somewhere like she did. So a moment of connection like that is wonderful with strangers, and far away from home. But I guess, like Mother Teresa used to say, you know, you need to, if you want to start loving people, you start with people in your own family, in your own home. Even in our own family, sometimes we're fractured with opinions and positions and points of view. And this polarizing just seems to be rather disturbing and upsetting. Brené says that we're geographically, politically, and even spiritually sorted ourselves into like-minded groups in which we silence dissent, grow more extreme in our thinking, and consume only facts that support our beliefs, making it easier to ignore evidence that our positions are wrong. As a result, we now live in a giant feedback loop, hearing our own thoughts about what's right and wrong bounced back to us by the television shows we watch, the newspapers and books we read, the blogs we visit, the sermons we hear, and the neighbourhoods we live in. I think, you know, it would be really easy, and my husband and I were talking about this when we were out for coffee today, it would be really easy to just sit up here on our house on the hill in this quiet little space, hang around with people who agree with us, people that we like, people that, you know, don't necessarily have the same, you know, who have the same views, who believe the same things. But one of the things we enjoy, we travel a lot. We travel for at least 3 months of the year. And this year we've travelled for almost 8 months of the year. We've visited many countries, many places, caught up with many people, and not all of them had the same views, come from the same country, the same culture, speak the same language, all sorts of differences. And yet from each person we've learnt something or had a point of connection, and it's actually expanded our own worlds and thinking. And I think we can become too rigid, and it is safe to be in our little closet and with people who think the same as we do. We've been told to find our tribe, and often our tribe are the ones that agree with us and support us, etc. But even within my own friendship groups, I have people that really are on opposite ends of the political spectrum, opposite ends of the opinion spectrum, especially considering things like the recent same-sex marriage debate. I have friends, you know, who are polarizingly different. I have people who have different sexual orientations or different styles of relationships. I have people who have different religions, but they're all in my friendship group, and I would consider them to be part of my tribe. But they're not all the same. And I think, I don't know what you think, maybe you can respond to this as we're chatting about it, but maybe you have found it a safe place and comforting, and I know I do, to say, well, you know, you can just be in this space of protecting, especially when you have children and you want to protect them and you want to bring them up and you put them in a safe school that you know where they're going to get taught stuff that you agree with, and you know, you want to try and keep them safe, but at the same time you want to maybe extend them and challenge them and get them to grow up to see that people aren't all the same. But there's this tension that we seem to find ourselves in. Brené says that often that family is one group where most of us choose to negotiate rather than sort our lives. In other words, that even if someone in the same family has different politics or different values, etc., we don't sever our relationship as a first resort. We actually try and work it out, or we just agree to disagree and we get along in, or as she said, you might have vulnerable, tough conversations and boundary settings. But if they fail entirely, then maybe you might sever a relationship. But generally, family, you just stick with. So I think there might be a lot of lonely people who, perhaps even in us being sorted from their own family, using Brené's terminology, to be sorted out. You're different, you don't fit, you don't belong. And we've been talking about that for the last 2 weeks, about personally feeling like we don't fit anywhere, or personally, how do we belong? How do we build relationships? How do we, you know, make sure that we keep connected with people? But it says in 1976, less than 25% of Americans lived in places where the presidential election was a landslide. In other words, we lived next door to and attended school and worshipped with people who held different beliefs than ours. We were ideologically diverse. Now, she's talking about the States, which is probably more so, but we are definitely becoming a bit like that in Australia. In contrast, in 2016, 80% of US counties gave either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton a landslide victory. Most of us no longer even live near people who are all that different from us in terms of political and social beliefs. And compared that to those figures, that 80% were of areas or counties were either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. In 1980, approximately 20% of Americans reported feeling lonely, and today it's more than double that percentage. It's happening around the world that loneliness is on the rise, and she puts this together and says, because we are so different and we're putting ourselves in these little communities and isolating ourselves and only hanging around with people who agree with us, are we at the same time, is this increasing people's loneliness? Maybe. We feel disconnected. Brené says our family uses the term the lonely feeling to describe all sorts of things. She says one of her children might say, I don't like that restaurant, it gives me the lonely feeling. Or can my friend spend the night here? Her house gives me that lonely feeling. And I guess lonely places are places you don't feel alive with connection. So this is where loneliness is different from being alone. And I think we've all, over the last couple of weeks, shared how sometimes we can feel lonely because we don't feel like we belong, even though we're surrounded by people. So I guess what it is that we can be so independent, we can be so autonomous, we can be in relationship, in work, etc., and look like we're really connected, but maybe not. Maybe we feel disconnected and feel that lonely feeling despite being in all these different situations. So I guess what we need to do is to go back to maybe some of the old-fashioned ideas of community and family and building more connections into that. Loneliness tells us that we need social connection, something as critical to our well-being as food and water. So one of the quotes I used in my blog today was about that very idea that love and connection is just as important a need as food and water in our lives. And I think I would really agree with that. I like my own company. I like being alone. I can be alone. I can travel alone. But I think if you don't have anyone to share your day with, or you don't have a sense of belonging somewhere or in some sort of group or situation, or have a sense that your opinion is heard and valid, all sorts of points of connection, you need to have a few relationships where that really matter. I think I would have a handful of friends really that are my ones, that I would call my ones, the ones that I would call in the middle of the night and say something terrible has happened or I'm really losing it. A handful of people I can be totally honest with about what I'm going through. Like last year when I had a bit of a mental health crisis, however you want to call it, there were a handful of people that at first I told about it. I mean, I ended up blogging about it publicly, but there were only a handful of people that really knew what I was going through. And they were my ones, they were my people, where I could be totally, totally authentic. I think it's like little circles. You do have your inner circle, your real dependence, but you still need those outer circles. You need your friends and your family, the thing, and then you need the community, and even now I think through traveling, I think I've developed like a world network of people that are part of my group and connectedness. But if I didn't have those ones that were in the middle, like the kernel, I would feel very lost. So I can go out and do things where I feel uncomfortable or out of my comfort zone, maybe don't feel like I belong, because I do know that I've got that core, if that makes sense. To me, that's a really important part of my life and how I can do what I do. People ask me all the time, how can you travel alone? How can you go to these places and you don't know people? And I always meet people, I make new friends, and there's a lot of people that I have great relationships all around the world. But the ones, we all need to have the one. But the other thing that Brené talks about is becoming the one, be the one that others need, is a great way to build connection. Some of the questions from last week's chapter and the comments, people were saying, how do I feel more connected? Well, maybe I need to become somebody's one as well. I would like to think that I am somebody's one. I mean, I know I'm that for my husband. I know that I'm that for my children and my family members and my core group of friends. I can't be the one for everybody. Otherwise, my one would be totally pulled apart and shattered, and my mental health would not be great. But I can be a one in a community that does my little bit, and then another person can be the one that does their little bit. And so as a community, we can feed that in the world. We can be the one that stands up and for others and next to other people and alongside other people and be a one for someone else. But it doesn't mean that you're destroying yourself. But that solid core, that core of who you are is, for me, I think it's about this thing about belonging and community in a world that is so polarizing. And that a lot of that Brené Brown talks about comes from fear. And I think that, if we're going to be vulnerable and say what we really feel about things, who we really are, not everyone's going to like that, or our authenticity. Not everyone's going to agree with us. Not everyone is going to, want to be a part of it. But our ones will. Our ones, the ones who are our ones, are going to be there for us. One line I really loved was, we have to step out from behind the barricades of self-preservation and brave the wild. And I blogged a little bit about that today, about getting out behind the borders of my comfort, the borders of what my usual is, in order to actually build connection in my own life. And Brené makes a really good point too. She says we need to find a way to feel hurt rather than spread hurt, and that's the way we can change the world. Instead of yelling from afar and refusing to help each other when we're struggling, we'll find the courage to show up for each other. And I think that's part of what I blogged about today, the infinite space of showing up. And sometimes we just need to show up as our authentic self. We need to show up for each other, and we need to make sure that I'm just looking up my blog from today so that we can I thought it was up, but it has disappeared from the page. I just wanted to quote from the last bit of my blog here. The question at the end I've put is, what if we showed up as ourselves? What if we become the one who others depend on? What if we find the courage to show up for each other? What if we show up and find our place in the world? What if we find true beginning? And my question to you and all the book clubbers today is, what does the infinite power of showing up look like in your friendship groups, your community, and on a worldwide scale? I mean, some of you travel the world and you do mission trips, or you belong to different things that go all across the world. So I'd be interested to know how you see this perspective of your inner core, your community, and then maybe even spreading out. How we can actually all be a part of being the one in the world, who will change some of this polarizing and this yelling at each other. Anyway, I am going to be on comments. I will have been commenting as you've been watching this, but we can continue the conversation and keep typing. And thanks for having a chat, and thanks for following along with Book Club. And next week we'll be back to Amanda's chapter, so look forward to that, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.